Hey, everybody, and welcome to the For Female Founders podcast series where we're helping women in business learn to thrive, not just survive. I am your host, Sarah Bundy, and today my guests are Sophie Warwick and Jillian Climie from The Thoughtful Co. The Thoughtful Co. specializes in developing in-house gender equity policies and chairing employee resource groups and advocacy groups. They co-founded The Thoughtful Co. so that they can build more gender-inclusive workplaces and build representation of women at senior levels across all different industries. They also help support women in negotiating for the compensation they deserve, and they support employers to build more inclusive workplaces. Ladies, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
It's good to see you both. And I love what you guys are doing out there. You both have really fascinating backgrounds. And I'm sure we're going to learn lots from you guys about how to become more inclusive as organizations, and also how women can really elevate themselves, whether they own their own businesses or whether they're working within a larger corporation. So let's talk about you guys first. Sophie, tell us a little bit about you, and then Jillian will go over to you. We'd love to hear, what's your background? How did you get into this?
Yeah, I had a pretty non-linear career path. I started in structural engineering, so very male-dominated, very technical role, and found it was difficult to just find other women to connect with for mentorship, but also peer support. So that led me to establish the employee resource groups as well as mentorship and sponsorship programs at the companies I was at. So first at Glutman Simpson and then at Intuitive. And recognizing it wasn't an internal challenge, it was industry wide. I then went on to co-found the nonprofit Women in Consulting Engineering, or WCE Vancouver, which is a nonprofit community for building inclusion for women in the engineering space with 2 Canadian chapters and just over 1,000 members. And while I sat as co-chair of that group, I had this amazing opportunity to meet so many incredible women doing amazing things in their careers, but sometimes not putting their hands up for promotions or negotiating their compensation, or sometimes leaving the firms they were at or the industry entirely because they weren't finding the right environments to be most successful. And on the flip side, I was also working directly with the companies that were sponsoring that organization who were really passionate about recruiting and retaining the same individuals. They just didn't always have the tools and resources in place to do so effectively. So the good news is everyone was aligned on this really positive goal, but needing some additional support. And that's really why I co-founded the Thoughtful Co with Jillian, so that we could support more women in showing up really powerfully at the workplace, and also more employers on building those more inclusive spaces.
That's so awesome. Sophie, thank you for your background and why you started this. Jillian, over to you. Tell us a little bit about you and how did you get into this?
Yeah, so I've spent my career in executive compensation, which is a bit of a niche field, but essentially working with board of directors to figure out how to pay their top executive teams, which is often a lot of longer term equity compensation design, bonus structure, things like that. So I did that in consulting and then at Aritzia, and most recently was at Lululemon, where I led the global equity and executive compensation teams. And really throughout my career had seen so many women not negotiating or leaving money on the table, especially when it came to things like sign-on awards or share ownership or bonus structure, which has such a big impact on your long-term wealth. And I always wanted to do something about it. So that's really what led me to co-found the Thoughtful Co, is supporting more women in negotiating. And then the more I get into this work, I realize, it shouldn't all be on women to just be negotiating. It really should be on companies to ensure they're creating equitable structures so that we don't have to negotiate more. So I love supporting from that company side as well as the individual side to kind of come at it from 2 angles.
You guys are incredibly well accomplished women in business, and I love that you both kind of come from very interesting backgrounds that is not the usual path into a career, right? So one in engineering, one in consulting, very large brands, working with big corporations. And tell us, before I want to go into why women don't put up their hands more and how women can show up powerfully. We talk a little bit about that. But tell us a little bit about the services that the Thoughtful Co offers, please. Thank you to our video sponsor, All Inclusive Marketing, for supporting women in business, diverse teams, and bringing value and innovation to the world.
Yeah, of course. So we have 3 primary service offerings that we provide. So the first is that we coach individuals, specifically women, in negotiating for their compensation at key points in their career. So this can be promotions, performance reviews, new job offers, or just anytime someone wants to have a meaningful conversation about compensation with their leader. So a lot of that work is through coaching sessions as well as contract review and some of those different elements. The next piece is that we advise employers on building more inclusive spaces with a specific focus on gender equity. So we will often do what we call an EDI, or an equity, diversity, and inclusion health check, an action plan, where we look at where they are today, current practices, their cultural structure, pair that with key stakeholder interviews to get a good sense of who they are, and then make recommendations on how they can start moving that needle in the future. Very much always tied to metrics. How do we measure change? We work a lot with companies in very technical fields, so engineering, construction, tech, and we're both from analytical backgrounds. We're very passionate about the numbers. If you're putting time into something, you want to make sure you know that you're making that change. And then we'll also help with the implementation. So for example, employee resource groups, mentorship, sponsorship programs, and all of those important pieces. And then our third service offering is combining those first two, really, in that we provide workshops for professional organizations, women's groups, as well as employers on both personal and professional development. So those can be things like compensation negotiation, advocating for yourself at work, building meaningful mentorship relationships, those types of topics, all the way to ones that are more focused on organizational change. So actionable strategies to build more inclusive workplaces, or also how to establish a culture of allyship within your workplace. So really focus on making that change from all different sides.
Why do you guys think companies are not succeeding as well as they should be today?
Yeah, I think that's a big question. And I think the more we get into this work, we need to have really objective HR structure, which is not the most exciting answer, but we need objective, recruiting, promotion, compensation practices, because we are all biased, right? I'm biased, Soph's biased, Sarah's biased. And that means that company leaders are biased as well. And so biases are impacting our decisions, right? We're more likely to hire someone that looks like us. We're more likely to deem a woman as being aggressive when she's, just being assertive like anyone else on a leadership team. So we really need to course correct our biases within the workplace. And if we have objectivity within our HR structures, that's a really great way to do that. And then pairing that with, building more awareness of our own personal biases. I mean, I've been on this journey myself over the past 5 years. It really started with reading this book called Bias, which was really life-changing for me. Highly recommend it. In our everyday interactions, how is it showing up? And especially as leaders, I think we really need to get to that level. I think newer generations are coming into the workplace, really demanding DE&I and wanting to make equitable workplaces. But we need to really get to that leadership level to ensure people understand their own biases, want to be investing in these things, and make change within HR structure in their companies.
What do you guys think are the biases that still exist today at that leadership level, whether it's female leadership or male leadership? Clearly, to your point, biases exist. We're wired in a certain way. We have our own life experiences, which, create beliefs over time in the way we operate. But what do you think are the biggest roadblocks that still exist outside of HR systems, but like from a mental perspective when it comes to leadership teams and how they hire and why they hire certain people, and then how they treat those people once they're hired?
I think the two that jump out to me most, number one being the similarity bias, in that we tend to gravitate towards people who are similar to us, but we also tend to evaluate someone who's similar to us in who they could be in the future, so their future potential, and someone who's dissimilar to us, we're evaluating where they could be today. So when we have these two identical candidates that we're always talking about, those hypothetical candidates that are the same in every way, one presents similar to you and one presents dissimilar, you're already starting to favor that similar person because you can see them in your role in the future, and the other person you're thinking about what they can do today. So when we have promotional decisions or hiring decisions with maybe one individual or a lot of uniformity in the individuals making that decision, there is a natural tendency to pick the tried and tested option who is the person who presents similarly, even if they're not actually the stronger candidate. And I think there's so much bias into who the strongest candidate is as well, because as Jillian mentioned earlier, there isn't always a lot of objectivity in that decision making. So I think similarity bias is a strong one that impacts all levels, how we compensate people, who we hire, and who we promote. And another one that I think is very focused on women specifically is the likability bias, in that on one hand, women are expected to be agreeable and likable to be assessed favorably in the workplace. But on the other hand, to be assessed favorably as a leader, women are expected to be direct and assertive. But sometimes when they exhibit those traits, they're more likely to get feedback than men that they are aggressive or bossy. So it can be really hard to balance these very conflicting demands. And so the way we're traditionally evaluating who a leader is, it might be more difficult for women to navigate presenting in those, more traditional or stereotypical presentations or behaviors of a leader, because they're more likely to get negative feedback from that. So it can be really challenging for women to negotiate or ask for that promotion because they are more likely to be received as being bossy.
So with the Thoughtful Co., do you guys help organizations overcome such biases? And how do you do so?
Yeah, definitely. I think we often do work with leadership teams and boards on first understanding that these biases exist. And that's such an important step, right? And that again, we are all biased. So it's not just coming in and saying, this CEO is biased or this board is biased. Like we all are. We all have these types of biases that impact our hiring decisions. I like to share an example. At a previous employer, my first hire on the team was someone who presented exactly same as I do. So we really try to normalize and understand that we all are biased. So that's kind of the first step that we typically do. And then within that EDI health check, we'll really look through, all the different areas in terms of how they hire, promote, compensate their employees, and see where we can make things more objective. And then oftentimes we'll pair that with other programs to make sure there's inclusivity throughout the organization. So things like employee resource groups, things like mentorship and sponsorship programs we're really excited about, which is kind of the next stage of mentorship and moving on to actually have someone be a sponsor for a woman or a person from an underrepresented group, maybe bringing them to client meetings, bringing them to networking events, putting their hand up for them for a stretch opportunity. So that really helps to disrupt that similarity bias that we often see. And then also leadership coaching throughout the organization as well. Often we work with boards and senior leaders, but sometimes there's key managers who maybe are struggling a bit more with overcoming their biases in a certain area. So we can do more of that targeted coaching as well. So it's really that structural change within HR, and then pairing that with programs and coaching that help to make sure it's actually permeating throughout the organization.
You talk a little bit about having advocates and people who would be willing to put up their hand on behalf of somebody else. But earlier in the conversation, Sophie, you'd also mentioned that a lot of women have a hard time just putting up their own hand. Why do you think that is? And what do women need to do today to overcome that fear of actually putting up their hand and leaning in?
Yeah, I always struggle with this because I think it's important to talk about imposter syndrome. I always like to caveat, because I think we constantly tell women they have imposter syndrome, which I think sometimes does more harm than good. But I do think that's a lot of where it stems from. It is very normal and a very real experience that if you're in a professional environment where your identity isn't reflected by those around you, or not reflected by those in senior leadership in the positions that you're aspiring to, there is a greater chance that you're going to feel the need to prove your worthiness. And that makes it harder to put your hand up. You get more challenged. I remember when I was practicing as a structural engineer, I was in a meeting that was just for structural and the architect. And another member of the architecture team came in and said, why is landscape in this meeting? And landscape architecture is more traditionally dominated by women, at least locally. And everyone was like, this is actually the structural engineer. And it, by itself is so minimal. We carried on with the conversation. Everyone was fine. The people I was working with directly really recognized my expertise. But it's that reminder of you weren't what I was expecting. And so I think those types of feelings go in so much to why someone might not put their hand up. They're afraid that they might be challenged more, that maybe their voice is quieter and they have to say something more times, because we do tend to speak in a higher pitch and lower volume. And so I think all of those things go into the challenges with being able to put your hand up. And then I think to overcome those feelings, I think taking stock of your strengths is really important. I like to actually write down a list of what I think I'm excelling at. So when you do have those thoughts challenging you, then you can at least reference that to help boost yourself up, and then really leveraging support from your network. So both peers, that can be people to commiserate with, but also sponsors, people who can advocate for your value and really speak up for you when someone isn't hearing you.
You talk a little bit about helping women prepare themselves for meaningful conversations or difficult conversations, or even negotiations for their compensation or for their team, and advocate for their team. What kinds of practices do you have them go through? What are the exercises women can go through to help them prepare for those difficult conversations or those meaningful conversations?
Yeah, a few strategies that we work with women on are one, really understanding your core strengths, tying those core strengths to key metrics within your organization or team. So demonstrating the impact, and then being able to confidently articulate those. And that's easier said than done, right? Women are socialized to be nice and agreeable, and it can feel really weird to go into a conversation and say, hey, I achieved this goal this year. It added to our revenue by X amount. And based on that, I'm hoping for Y. But that is so, so powerful. Really understanding your own value and being able to articulate it is such a game changer within negotiations, within difficult conversations in general. And that does take time and practice and prep, right? Oftentimes we can't just go into those conversations and do that really confidently. We need to allocate time to ourselves. We always say, we work so hard for employers, but we don't spend that much time making sure we're getting the best compensation or getting that promotion or whatever it might be. So really allocating that time for yourself to prep. And we do recommend for most difficult conversations, like a negotiation, actually writing out a script, which sounds funny, but it's so helpful when there's something really clear that you want to get across or ask for, just to have that to refer to help you practice, and it will make you feel more confident going into it. And sometimes confidence is, half the battle in these conversations.
I've personally been working with a mentee. I won't name names, but it was a really amazing lady. It is a very amazing lady. And she was advocating for a raise and a promotion. And we worked together for 6 months to help her understand what she needed to do in order to get there, and a lot of it was understanding her value, understanding her strengths, and matching that to the needs of the business and the KPIs of the business, and understanding the objectives of the business, and then coming with facts and stats and saying, here it just is on paper, black and white, right? And she advocated for herself, and she got the raise, and she got the promotion, which is exciting, but not a lot of people know how to do that, right? So back to your point of write the script, understand your strengths, make sure they're tied to the company values and objectives and KPIs and purpose, right? But how do people in general understand what those needs of the business are if they're not entirely clear? What recommendations do you have for them?
Yeah, I think thinking about a broad range of different metrics and KPIs, I think sometimes when we have those conversations, especially if we're talking to someone who's maybe earlier in their career or in a more internal role, it's so easy to say, well, I'm not bringing in new clients, or I'm not directly revenue driving. So I think there is a greater tendency to say, well, I'm not contributing directly to the business. But start thinking about what you're completing in your role and what the impact is in your role. And then you can see how that relates to the broader company metrics. So For example, someone might have created a fantastic internal tool that saves everyone on their team 2 hours every week. That's a huge amount of savings throughout the course of the year that now all of those people can go work on more direct revenue driving or higher priority items because they've saved this admin time. So at the outset, it feels, oh, I'm not bringing in these new clients, I'm not contributing to revenue, but indirectly, I actually am providing a lot of impact. So I think a great strategy to build that, regardless of what your role is, if it's internal, external, more senior, more junior, thinking about what do I do and what is the impact of that, and then working back, because it doesn't always need to be something that's very specifically tied to the exact KPI that your company might be writing down at their annual meeting every year. It could be a different KPI that's ultimately helping them meet those goals.
Like efficiency and profitability and number of hours allocated to something manual that someone created a solution for, compounded over the year. I think that's a fantastic example, Sophie. Thank you so much. Let's shift a little bit and talk about the Thoughtful Co. and the types of businesses that you guys typically like to help, right? You had mentioned a little bit about tech, engineering, kind of industries where there's not a lot of female representation. Can you tell us a little bit more about those industries and how do you break into them?
Yeah, so within our employer consulting, we really do focus on engineering, construction, technology, and a bit of finance as well. We've gone outside of that too, but that seems to be, really where we can have the most impact. So that's where our focus is. They're quite male dominated. Sophie is a structural engineer by trade and has spent her career, off the side of her desk doing this work already. So has that inside knowledge of the workings of engineering firms, of construction firms. And that's been so helpful for us in making sure that we're meeting firms where they're at. And then I bring that external HR perspective from consulting in different companies. So we can have that best practice in there as well. And that combination seems to work really well for our employer clients to understand where they're at, how these companies work, the inner workings of them, and then still have some of that best practice HR perspective. And I think to get into those organizations, that's the combination that works really well for us. And then we also are very data driven. We are very research focused as well. Within our recommendations, we try to make sure they're always based in best practice research. Within our workshops that we do for employers, we have one on the value of gender equity at work, which just talks about all the different amazing financial benefits, cultural benefits, sustainability benefits, innovation benefits. So I think that really gives us a differentiator in our consulting too. We try to be very action-oriented, research-based, data-based, which resonates well with those types of employers.
That's awesome. And how do you start those conversations, and with whom do you start those conversations?
Yeah, it can be quite varied. I think a lot of times our initial conversations are with senior leaders, often those who might identify as women, who have recognized, their own personal challenges and want to get a little bit of support. So often these initiatives are run on the sides of people's desks, especially a lot of the companies we work with are small and medium-sized organizations who maybe have smaller HR teams. They don't have a dedicated team member who could work on EDI to the full capacity. So needing some additional support. And yeah, really through speaking to people with lived experience, or often it's allies who have really recognized a gap and they want to fix it, but they don't know where to start. And I think so often it feels really daunting. It feels like they have a long way to go and they don't know what the individual steps are to get there. And so I think it's really helpful to provide that breakdown of here are small little steps that you can take throughout the next few years to make a lot of meaningful change, and this is where to start. Don't focus on these ones yet. We'll get there in the future, so it doesn't feel quite so overwhelming.
That makes sense. So I'm going to leave this, because we're almost out of time, I'm going to leave this with two final asks of you guys. One, what are the words of advice that you have for companies who want to do a better job with EDI efforts and want to lift up their very talented women in business to more leadership positions? So we need some words of advice for them. And then what words of advice do you have for women in business who are trying to work their way up that ladder and get the recognition that they deserve?
I can start with with women who are trying to move their way up the corporate ladder, or maybe also start their own businesses and go that route as well. So I would say really allocate time to yourself. Understand that it takes prep and practice and time to push yourself forward in your career. And so often we think we can just be heads down working hard and it'll always get noticed. But I've spent my career inside compensation teams and HR teams, and sometimes it is the squeaky wheel that gets the promotion or the compensation increase or whatever it might be. So really taking time for yourself, preparing, practicing, leveraging mentors, support, coaches if you need, people like yourself and the Thoughtful Co who can support you in your journey. And similar with women business owners too, we work with women business owners on setting their rates. We so often come across women who have undersold themselves and are charging really low hourly rates. So pushing yourself in that area too, making sure that you're understanding your own value that you provide it as a business, especially within the hours that you're giving to other people. Sophie and I are so great at this now, making sure you're getting paid for things like speaking events or extra work you're doing, really charging all the hours that you are adding value to your clients. So I like to share that side of it as well.
So important and actually so overlooked. A lot of women will do work for free, pro bono, just because A, they're nice, and B, they want to help, and C, they don't know their value, right? So being able to advocate for themselves on that and know the dollar amount that they should be charging for that value. So important. I think that's a great point. Thanks, Jillian. Sophie, what about you? Maybe you can speak to the corporate side. Words of advice.
I think almost the strongest piece is communication. I hear the greatest fear around sharing efforts from organizations sometimes that I think are actually doing the most work and the most valuable work. And I think it's because they know how long the road is. They know it's a journey. They know they're not done yet. So there is this great fear of sharing anything because they don't want to be misperceived as we believe that we're done and that we've done all the work. And which I think is a challenge because I think communicating, this is our intent, these are our gaps, these are our goals, and these are the actions that we're taking to get there are incredibly important. So both externally, it's candidates we know now, especially in the more intermediate or earlier stages in their careers, are looking for strong value alignment with the companies that they're working at, and they want to see the specific actions that those companies are taking. It doesn't mean you have to go out and say that you're done, but if you do have some great employee resource groups and you're sponsoring these really impactful outreach groups or whatever it might be, sharing those efforts so that people know that they're available. And then additionally, on the internal communication side, I think the same thing that can happen is sometimes the folks who are leading that change, again, fear updating the rest of the team because they're not done yet and they want to share a complete and final product. But the challenge is then sometimes the team members who are removed from those conversations might be at a greater retention risk because they don't know that those things are happening. So they're just seeing where it is today and feel that no change is being made. However, if they knew about all those goals and those initiatives that are going to be launched next year and in the future years and had an avenue to communicate their own feedback and feel supported, they're much more likely to stay long term. People recognize it's not something that happens overnight. And so I think sharing meaningful communication of knowing that you're not done yet, but these are our goals, these are the actions that we're taking, and then this is how you can get in touch with us and share your feedback is so important. And I completely appreciate there is that fear around communication because it is a journey, but I think sharing those incremental steps is really valuable.
And it's better to start than not to start at all. So even getting a foot in the door, coming to the table and saying, look, I know that there's something to this. I might not know all of the things, but I'm willing to learn and I'm willing to have the conversation is probably just a good place to start.
Exactly.
Love it. Well, thank you guys so much for being on the show. I'm sure there's women who are listening to this and men who are listening to this and companies who are listening to this who've got some inspiration from it, got some tips. If anybody wants to contact you for some help and support and wants to work with the Thoughtful Co., what's the best way to contact you guys?
Yeah, so our website is www.thethoughtfulco.net, and you can also email us at contact@thethoughtfulco.net. And we are on Instagram and LinkedIn as well. You can add us or add The Thoughtful Co. We'd love to hear from you. You can probably tell we love to chat about these things, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Amazing. Thanks so much, ladies. We'll catch up with you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the For Female Founders podcast series. If you enjoyed this episode, please go ahead and hit subscribe, like, or comment below so we can continue to support women in business by helping them thrive, not just survive. We'll see you on the next show.